In 2011, From Software went from being the developer of niche, lesser-known titles into a household name with the release of its genre-defining Dark Souls. Fast forward 11 more years, and this once obscure studio would be piloting one of the most critically acclaimed titles of a generation. But even with 2022's release of Elden Ring blowing everyone away, there was still a large number of players that found From Software's trademark difficulty to be too much to contend with for the promised enjoyment said to be lurking on the other side of victory. While Elden Ring's difficulty posed a lower bar for entry than the Souls series before it, even the most hardened among the studio's fanbase agreed that the game's true challenge had to be sought out. Responsible for more broken controllers than any other boss anywhere else in the game, this was the wall that many players would run into that seemed nearly impossible to break through. But there was no weapon, spell, or strategy you could employ with a higher chance of victory than to summon an absolute legend from beyond the veil and simply sit back and watch the show. So, join me on the deep dive, my jarnished friends, as we look into the story of Let Me Solo Her. While the hero of our story gained prominence with the release of Elden Ring's hardest boss, our story actually begins with its predecessor in Dark Souls 3. There, in the iconic opening sequence that sets the tone for the game, you retrieve a coiled sword to light the fires ahead of you, but not until after you beat the game's first boss. Like every other Souls game before it, many gamers curious about the Souls-like genre would find the repeated defeats to this boss to be their only exposure to the series before packing it in, never to return. Curiously, the hero of our story was very close to being one of them. A player by the name of Klein Suboy had picked up Dark Souls 3 like many others, and like a fair few of those, this was their first exposure to not just the series, but the difficulty and challenges of Souls games altogether. After dying dozens and dozens of times to the game's first boss, he was nearly convinced that whatever fun could be had in this game surely couldn't be worth all the trouble of getting to experience it. But in a sequence of events that is almost signature to the genre, Klein eventually emerged victorious after a great deal of trial and error to experience the uniquely Soulsian euphoria of achieving victory after being nearly broken by repeated defeats. He would continue chasing the fleeting high of his success through the rest of the game until beating it, and like many who came before him and the many more who would come after, he waited with patient excitement for the release of what many consider to be From Software's magnum opus. And now at the forefront of those looking to push deep into the secrets of FromSoft's biggest title to date, Klein would eventually stumble upon the boss that would become one of the most defining fights in any Souls game ever.
What the is this piece of
In a short window of time following Elden Ring's release, there was almost universal agreement that Millennia was so difficult the fight bordered on being unfair. But for Klein Suboy, Millennia was just another in a long line of challenges that he had used to grow, learn, and develop. And following 242 deaths into his early training period, he would eventually master Millennia to the extent that he could best her with flawless precision. However, even with his mastery, there was something about this victory that fell flat. He had developed the knowledge and skill necessary to beat her, but much like the struggles he faced in his first exposure to the genre, there were many out there who would likely find Millennia to be the straw that broke them and turned them away from the genre for good. It was then that Klein Suboy got an idea that would eventually change the trajectory of his life forever. You see, with all of the tools that Elden Ring provides, lead developer Miyazaki Hidetaka had an interest in developing one of them more than any other. When traveling up a snowy hill in his hometown of Shinjuku, Japan, Miyazaki's car had gotten stuck. With whipping winds and blustering snow, Miyazaki's prayers were answered when several people stumbled through the storm into view to get his car unstuck, only to disappear back into the obscurity of the veiling storm mere moments after his car was heaved back onto the road. That moment stuck with him in an important and meaningful way. And when looking to implement more advanced multiplayer options into From Software's titles, Miyazaki wanted to mirror the seemingly fated intervention from helpful strangers that came to his aid, only to see them disappear like a specter after the job had been completed. It was this role of the selfless hero that Klein would aim to fill. Creating a new character with the name Let Me Solo Her, Klein wanted to go with a name that made it clear he was there to ease the burden that Millennia had imposed upon many players before. Utilizing perhaps one of the most stripped-down builds you can assemble out of Elden Ring's over 300 weapons, 170 spells, and 560 pieces of armor, Let Me Solo Her's build consisted of the game's starting katana, the early release favorite Rivers of Blood, and otherwise included no armor, other than the relatively underpowered Jar helmet. Once his superhero costume was assembled and his identity was properly hidden, Let Me Solo Her would cast his mark outside the door to the game's hardest boss, and wait. Called into action by Weary Tarnished that simply needed an extra edge in pushing past the game's hardest hurdle, nobody expected the savior that would be sent. Very soon after his first efforts, a player by the name of Sazed would take to Reddit to offer a personalized thanks to the hero that had slayed his final remaining foe before fading into obscurity like helpful strangers in a storm. And if the story had ended there, even that might be of value. The idea that there was someone out there wishing to help others overcome a challenge he once faced for no other reason than to be helpful, there's something wholesome and rewarding about that. But despite Sazed not thinking Let Me Solo Her would even see it, it only took until later that day for the hero to be brought into the light. Posting his own response, like a bat signal appearing on a rooftop, Klein sent a message to all who walked the lands between, that his sign would be down for desperate Tarnished in need. From there, sightings began to flood in across social media as this faceless hero was not only true to his word, but had been killing Malenia for hundreds and hundreds of players nearing the end of their proverbial rope. And then, on May 10th of 2022, just 3 months after the game's release, Klein would share the special milestone of his 1,000th kill with his continually growing fanbase live. That is 1,000 times that he faced the game's greatest challenge, and 1,000 times he emerged victorious with nearly flawless execution. But more importantly, that would mark 1,000 players whose game didn't come to an end there. Of all the people he helped, the vast majority were just one small helping hand away from clearing the game's hardest finish line. And Let Me Solo Her was happy to step in as the intangible symbol of what a supportive gaming community could be. Not the hero we deserved, but the hero we needed. And even still, Let Me Solo Her's journey wouldn't end there. He would go on to continue killing Malenia for Weary Tarnished, and after an estimated 1,200 hours of gameplay and 6,000 kills, Klein would announce his final foray into the Halig Tree, before moving on to experience the game's DLC no different than any other player. While it would mark the end of an era, if that was the end of the story, then that too would prove enough. To selflessly aid thousands during their frustration and stress to seek no exposure or recognition outside of pseudonyms and internet handles? That would be enough. But as it turns out, despite the countless fans he had amassed, the many stories written about him, and the overall impact he had on the game, his greatest achievement would be the mark he left on the community. Let Me Solo Her was no longer a player. He was a legend. And like any good legend, it inspired others to become heroes themselves. Before long, there were many places in the lands between that Tarnished had previously dreaded for their tedium and difficulty that would now have stalwart heroes on standby, offering a helping hand to anyone in need. And even a few who might not be looking to lead the way to victory, but at least provide a break from your frustration with a little humor and levity. Regardless of where you were in the game, where you found yourself struggling, or how long you'd been suffering from defeat, one man's imprint ensured that an army of allies had flooded the lands between, ready to answer the call. In times where it's all too easy to feel like you're facing your challenges alone, it's important to remember that if you need a hero, there's always someone out there looking to help. But perhaps more importantly, if you dedicate yourself to overcoming those challenges in front of you, you may just end up becoming the hero for somebody else.